February 18, 1968. The Ed Sullivan Show was running exactly on schedule. The Supremes were about to perform. George Carlin had his jokes ready. 23 million Americans settled in for their Sunday night tradition. Then a father from Pittsburgh appeared backstage with an envelope. Inside, a photograph of his 17-year-old son, who'd vanished 11 days earlier. The network executives said no. This wasn't a news program. They didn't do missing persons. But when Ed Sullivan learned the boy had been carrying a ticket to his show the night he disappeared, something shifted. The most powerful man in television made a decision that would shatter 2 decades of perfect control. What happened when that photograph filled the screen would change more than just one family's life. It would prove that sometimes the greatest power isn't in the show you deliver. It's in the one you are brave enough to break. The Ed Sullivan Theater hummed with its usual pre-show energy that February evening. Stagehands adjusted lights while the Supremes ran through their harmonies one final time. In the control booth, director Tim Kiley checked his rundown sheet. Every act timed to the second, every commercial break precisely placed. This was episode 948, and after 2 decades, the Sullivan machine operated with military precision. But in the shadows near the stage door, security guard Tommy Morrison faced an unusual situation. A middle-aged man in a rumpled gray suit had been standing there for 2 hours, clutching a manila envelope like it contained his life savings. His name was Robert Caldwell, and he'd driven straight through from Pittsburgh, 14 hours without stopping, fueled by black coffee and desperation. Inside that envelope was a photograph of Jimmy Caldwell, 17 years old, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubborn jaw. A small scar above his left eyebrow told the story of a bicycle accident when he was 8, the day Robert had taught him that falling was just part of learning to ride. Now Jimmy was missing, and that scar had become one of the details Robert recited to every police officer, every bus station clerk, every stranger who would listen. The story Robert told anyone who'd stop was always the same. Jimmy had left Pittsburgh on February 7th, carrying a suitcase his grandmother had given him and wearing his grandfather's St. Christopher medal. He was headed to New York for the opportunity of a lifetime, an audition at Juilliard for their drama program. The boy who'd played Tom in the Glass Menagerie at Allegheny High School was ready for the biggest stage in America. The last time anyone heard from Jimmy was a payphone call from Cleveland. The bus had mechanical problems, he'd said. He'd catch the next one. His voice had sounded excited, nervous, the voice of a kid about to chase his dreams. That was 11 days ago. Robert had already been to the police, the FBI, every hospital between Pittsburgh and New York. The only clue was Jimmy's suitcase, found abandoned at the Port Authority bus terminal. Inside, between his carefully folded shirts, was a ticket to the Ed Sullivan Show, dated 3 weeks ago, a gift from his mother for his 17th birthday. The Caldwell family had watched Ed Sullivan together every Sunday night since Jimmy was 7. It was their tradition, their connection to a bigger world beyond Pittsburgh's steel mills. Jimmy would practice introducing acts in Ed's distinctive style, making his little sister Lucy laugh until she couldn't breathe. Stage manager Bob Precht had seen everything in his years working for his father-in-law. He'd handled drunken comedians, temperamental divas, and even a dancing bear that had escaped into the audience. But the man with the envelope was different. There was something in Robert Caldwell's eyes that made Precht stop and listen, even though the show was starting in 20 minutes. When Precht heard about the Sullivan Show ticket in Jimmy's suitcase, something clicked. He knew Ed's strict rule about never deviating from the rundown. The show was a Swiss watch. Every second accounted for, every moment rehearsed. But Precht also knew that Ed had a 17-year-old grandson himself. He made a decision that would normally cost someone their job. He'd bring this to Ed during the first commercial break. The show began like any other. Ed strode out to thunderous applause, his shoulders square, his voice commanding. "Tonight, right here on our stage, we have a really big show for you." The audience settled into their seats, ready for their weekly dose of variety entertainment. Diana Ross adjusted her microphone while her fellow Supremes took their positions. George Carlin reviewed his notes one last time, preparing 7 minutes of observations about everyday life. But during that first commercial break, everything changed. Precht approached Ed with just 90 seconds to spare before they went back on air. He spoke quickly, urgently about the father backstage. Ed's first response was pure reflex. They had a show to run, protocols to follow. CBS didn't pay for a missing persons bureau. They paid for entertainment. Then Precht mentioned the ticket in Jimmy's suitcase, and Ed's expression shifted. A 17-year-old kid who loved the show enough to buy a ticket 3 weeks in advance. A father who'd driven through the night because he didn't know where else to turn. Ed looked toward the wings where Robert Caldwell stood, still holding that envelope, and saw something that made him forget 20 years of rigid format. "Bring him out here," Ed said, shocking everyone within earshot. Precht hesitated. This wasn't just breaking format, it was shattering it. But Ed's tone left no room for argument. "When we come back from commercial, bring him out." In the control booth, director Tim Kiley watched his carefully planned show begin to unravel. The network executives would have his head for this. But when he saw Ed's face on the monitor, a mixture of determination and something deeper, something paternal, Kiley made his own choice. He'd keep the cameras rolling no matter what happened next. Sometimes he thought television had to be about more than just entertainment. Sometimes it had to be human. The red light flashed, and America returned from commercials expecting Diana Ross's crystalline voice. Instead, they got Ed Sullivan speaking words no one had scripted. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have an unusual situation tonight. A father needs our help." The control booth fell silent. In millions of living rooms, families leaned forward, sensing something unprecedented was happening. Robert Caldwell walked onto the most famous stage in America like a man walking through a dream. His gray suit, the same one he'd worn to church last Sunday when he'd prayed for Jimmy's return, looked even more rumpled under the harsh stage lights. Ed took the photograph from his shaking hands with unexpected gentleness, holding it up to camera 2. For the first time in 20 years of broadcasts, a missing person's face filled the screen where entertainers usually stood. Jimmy's face stared out at America, young, hopeful, with that distinctive scar above his left eyebrow. Ed's voice, usually clipped and professional, carried weight as he read from Robert's handwritten notes. James Robert Caldwell, 17 years old, 5'10", 155 pounds. Last seen February 7th at the Cleveland Greyhound station. He was coming to New York to audition for Juilliard's drama program. The studio audience of 600 sat in absolute stillness. Diana Ross and her fellow Supremes stood frozen in the wings, their sequined gowns catching the light like suspended stars. Ed continued reading details that transformed Jimmy from a photograph into someone's son. Honor student, lead in his high school play, wearing his grandfather's St. Christopher medal that had survived World War II. Then Robert Caldwell spoke, and his voice carried the exhaustion of 11 sleepless nights. "Jimmy, if you're watching this..." He had to stop, swallow, start again. "Your mother hasn't left the phone. She jumps every time it rings, thinking it's you. Your sister Lucy keeps setting your place at dinner. She says you're just running late, like always." His voice cracked on the word always, and the microphone caught it, sent it out to 23 million Americans. "Whatever happened, son, whatever trouble you might be in, we don't care. We just need to know you're alive. Just call us. Call collect. Call anyone. Let someone know you're okay." The camera stayed on Robert's face as tears finally came, the kind of tears a Pittsburgh steelworker would normally never let anyone see. Ed Sullivan, the man who'd maintained professional composure through presidential visits and Beatles hysteria, reached for his handkerchief. The camera caught him placing his hand on Robert's shoulder, a gesture so uncharacteristic that CBS phone operators would later report hundreds of calls from viewers asking if Ed was feeling all right. But Ed wasn't thinking about his image or his reputation. "We're going to find your boy," Ed said, his voice carrying a conviction that made viewers believe him. He turned to face camera one with an intensity that transformed him from host to advocate. If anyone watching knows anything about Jimmy Caldwell, if you've seen him, if you know where he might be, call your local police immediately. Or call CBS. Call us here at the theater. This boy wanted to be an actor. He wanted to be on this stage, right now. His family just wants him home. The control room phone rang immediately. Then another line lit up. Within 60 seconds, all 16 phone lines at CBS Studio 50 were jammed. Tim Kiley kept all 3 cameras rolling, abandoning the rundown sheet entirely. The Supremes' performance window passed unmarked. George Carlin's comedy slot evaporated. This was no longer the Ed Sullivan Show. It was something else entirely, something raw and necessary. Ed kept talking, filling the airtime with stories Robert had shared backstage. How Jimmy had played Stanley Kowalski in Drama Club, practicing Brando's famous Stella cry until the neighbors complained. How he'd saved money from his job at his uncle's hardware store to buy a suit for the Juilliard audition. How his acceptance letter, with its partial scholarship, had made his father cry for the first time Jimmy had ever seen. Then Ed's voice broke completely. Somewhere out there, a 17-year-old kid who loves theater is trying to find his way. He bought a ticket to this show 3 weeks ago for his birthday. He wanted to sit right there. Ed pointed to the audience. And watch the magic happen. Let's bring him home to his family. The studio audience rose spontaneously, not applauding, just standing as witnesses to something beyond entertainment. Diana Ross stepped forward, still in her sequined gown, and spoke unrehearsed into Ed's microphone. "We'll stay here all night if it helps find him. This is somebody's baby." The calls kept flooding in. A waitress in Philadelphia was certain she'd served someone matching Jimmy's description 4 days ago. He'd ordered coffee but barely touched it, seemed confused about what day it was. A hotel clerk in Baltimore remembered a young man asking about train schedules to New York, wearing what looked like an old military medal. Each lead was carefully noted by CBS staff who'd abandoned their regular duties to help. Then, at 9:34 p.m., a call came through that changed everything. A nurse at Newark Beth Israel Hospital was watching the show from the break room. The description matched a patient in room 314, an unidentified young man, unconscious since February 8th, with a St. Christopher medal and a scar above his left eyebrow. Ed Sullivan stopped mid-sentence, his hand going up to silence the studio. The audience held its breath as he listened to someone speaking urgently in his earpiece. On live television, 23 million Americans watched Ed's eyes widen, then fill with tears he didn't try to hide. "Robert," he said, turning to the father who stood frozen beside him. "They may have found Jimmy. Newark Hospital. There's a car waiting. Go now." Robert Caldwell ran off the stage, leaving Ed standing alone under the lights. For a moment, television's most composed host seemed lost, unsure how to continue. George Carlin had come out for his routine, but stood silent in the wings. The Supremes huddled together, Diana Ross openly weeping. Ed looked directly into the camera and spoke without cue cards, without preparation, words that would be remembered long after that night. 20 years I've stood on this stage. I've introduced the Beatles, Elvis, every legend you can name. But tonight we did something different. Tonight we remembered that television can be more than entertainment. It can bring us together when it matters most. It can be the light that guides someone home. The next morning, newspapers across America carried the same photograph. Robert Caldwell at his son's bedside in Newark Beth Israel Hospital. Jimmy had been mugged at the Port Authority bus terminal, struck in the head, and lost his memory for 11 days. He'd been found unconscious in an alley, brought to the hospital with no identification except the St. Christopher medal. The scar above his eyebrow, mentioned on national television, had been the final confirmation the nurse needed. Jimmy recovered fully. 6 months later, Ed Sullivan kept a promise no one knew he'd made. He brought Jimmy back to Studio 50, not as a missing person, but as a guest. On the same stage where his father had pleaded for his return, Jimmy performed Stanley Kowalski's monologue from A Streetcar Named Desire. Ed introduced him simply, a young man who proves that dreams, even when interrupted, can still come true. The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes. Jimmy went on to graduate from Juilliard, though he never became the Broadway star he'd once imagined. Instead, he spent 30 years teaching drama to underprivileged youth in the Bronx, telling each class about the night Ed Sullivan stopped his show for one missing boy. He named his own son Edward, after the man who proved that sometimes the most important performance is the one you're willing to stop. That February night in 1968 remains the most requested episode in the Sullivan archive. Not for the Supremes, who never got to perform. Not for George Carlin, who came back the following week. But for the moment when television remembered its deepest purpose, to connect us when connection matters most.